Tonight, we're leaving behind the glow of your phone and the hum of your own century, and traveling somewhere far older, far hotter, and far more golden. We're going back more than 3,000 years, to the sun-baked banks of the Nile, to sit at the feet of a queen whose face is more famous than her name. Tonight, we spend some time with Nefertiti, a woman who helped topple 1,000 years of religion, who was carved into stone as an equal to her king, and who then, without warning, disappeared from the historical record entirely, as if she had never existed at all. Before you get too comfortable, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And if this is your first night with us, welcome. We're glad to have you drifting off in our company. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is right where you are. If you'd rather close your eyes completely and just listen, we're on Spotify now too, links in the description below. And to everyone already supporting the channel as a member, thank you, sincerely. There's a brand new A-Tower video waiting for you, more than enough to see you through until morning. If membership sounds like something you'd enjoy, the door's always open, but only if and when it feels right for you. Now go ahead and settle in. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Maybe switch on a fan for that low, steady background hum. And let's drift together into the world of the beautiful one. Before we step into her story properly, sit with a question for a moment. What was it actually like to be the most recognizable woman on Earth, more than 3,000 years before the camera was ever invented? Did she really look the way that famous bust suggests, or was some clever sculptor simply being kind to his queen? What happens when the most powerful man in the world decides, on a whim of faith, to erase every god his people have ever worshipped and replace them all with a single disk in the sky? And how does a woman so visible, so carved into history, so celebrated in her own lifetime, vanish so completely that scholars are still arguing about her fate today? This is the story of Nefertiti, a name that isn't really a name at all, but closer to an announcement. In the language of the Egyptians, it translates roughly to, "The beautiful one has arrived." It's a bold thing to name a newborn, a little like putting a 5-star review on a product before it's even left the factory. And yet, by every account that survives her, the name turned out to be accurate, which, if you think about it, is somehow even more irritating. But a lovely name and an unforgettable face tell us surprisingly little about the woman underneath them. Ancient Egypt was a civilization obsessed with permanence, obsessed with carving things into stone that would outlast time itself. And yet it was strangely careless about preserving the ordinary truths of a person's life. Pharaohs had their victories inscribed in loving detail and their failures quietly sanded away. Queens, more often than not, were rendered as idealized symbols rather than flesh and blood women. So when we look at Nefertiti today, we're looking at a figure who has passed through 3,000 years of royal image management, with several key chapters simply missing. Here's what we can say for certain. She lived at the center of one of the strangest and most radical chapters in the entirety of Egyptian history, a moment when one royal couple tried to tear down a belief system that had stood, unquestioned, for over 1,000 years. She wasn't a spectator to this upheaval. She was one of its architects, elevated to a level of visibility that, by the standards of her time, bordered on the scandalous. And then there's the peculiar afterlife of her fame. Nefertiti's face has been reproduced on posters, referenced in films, and gazed upon by millions of museum visitors. And yet for nearly all of the 3,000 years between her death and our present moment, almost nobody on Earth knew her name. Her rediscovery is its own remarkable story, and we'll arrive at it together before the night is through. For now, just sit with the contradiction of her. Famous and unknown. Everywhere and nowhere. A face without a finished biography. It's a little like spotting someone across a crowded room, feeling absolutely certain you know them, and then realizing you can't recall a single fact about their life. Now stretch that feeling across 30 centuries, and you have some sense of what it's like to study Nefertiti. So tonight we'll try to fill in as much of the outline as the evidence allows, from her clouded origins to her dazzling rise, to the sun-drenched city she helped build in the middle of the desert, to the sudden, unexplained silence that swallowed her. We'll meet the strange, intense young king she married. We'll meet the god he decided was the only one worth worshipping. And we'll watch the world that eventually tried, quite deliberately, to make sure both of them were forgotten. But before we can understand the woman, we need to understand the Egypt that shaped her, a kingdom so wealthy, so ancient, and so utterly convinced of its own permanence, that nobody could have guessed it was about to be shaken by one girl and one restless prince. To understand where Nefertiti came from, we have to stand for a moment in the Egypt that produced her, the Egypt of the 18th dynasty, somewhere around 1370 years before the modern era. This was arguably the richest and most powerful version of Egypt that would ever exist. Gold poured in from Nubian mines to the south. Tribute arrived from conquered territories. And in the ancient city of Thebes, the great temple complex of the god Amen gleamed with centuries of offerings from a priesthood that had grown almost unimaginably wealthy. Try to picture Egypt in this moment as a civilization utterly certain of itself. It had already been ancient by the time it built the pyramids, and those pyramids, by Nefertiti's era, were older to her than the fall of the Roman Empire is to us today. This wasn't a young nation still finding its footing. This was a superpower with a 1,000-year head start, and the confidence to match it. The wealth on display was staggering. Egypt sat at the crossroads of the ancient world's trade routes. Its granaries were fat with the yearly flooding of the Nile. Its treasury vaults were stacked with gold hauled up from the south. Foreign kings wrote letter after letter to the Egyptian court, practically begging for a share of that wealth, with about as much subtlety as a distant relative who only calls when money's involved. And Egypt, for its part, tended to respond with the unhurried patience of a kingdom that knew exactly who held the purse strings. At the spiritual center of all this stood Amen, king of the gods, and his sprawling temple complex at Thebes. Across generations, the priests who served Amen had quietly accumulated land, gold, and political influence to rival the pharaoh's own household. They controlled enormous estates. They employed small armies of laborers and scribes, and they oversaw the rituals that, in the Egyptian worldview, kept the entire cosmos from sliding into chaos. Questioning their authority would have felt, to most Egyptians, about as sensible as questioning the flooding of the Nile itself. It simply wasn't done. Egyptian society, meanwhile, was arranged with almost mathematical precision. A pyramid within the pyramids, you might say, with the pharaoh at its peak. The king wasn't just a political ruler. He was considered a living bridge between the human world and the divine, personally responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the delicate cosmic balance of truth, order, and rightness that kept the universe from unraveling. Beneath him sat the nobility, the priesthood, and the officials. Below them, the scribes and skilled craftsmen, and at the base of it all, the farmers, whose labor along the Nile fed everyone standing above them. Everyone understood their position. The entire system was presented, and largely believed, to be eternal, unshakable, and simply correct. It was into this atmosphere of total confidence and total tradition that a girl of noble birth was born, a girl who would eventually grow up to help set fire to nearly all of it. There's a certain delicious irony in that. A civilization so proud of its permanence was about to produce a royal couple determined to prove that nothing, in fact, was permanent at all. Because that's the strange thing about golden ages. They tend to breed the exact kind of confidence that produces people bold enough, or reckless enough, to imagine something entirely new. The very stability that made Egypt so formidable also made it, in a strange way, ripe for someone convinced they had a better idea. And a better idea was coming, though nobody born into this comfortable, gilded moment could possibly have predicted it. For now, though, our future queen was simply a privileged child in the wealthiest kingdom on earth. To understand how she rose to the position she eventually held, we need to look more closely at exactly who she might have been, and where, amid all this splendor, she actually came from. And that, frustratingly, is exactly where the trail starts to run cold. Here is where the real mystery begins. For a woman this famous, Nefertiti's beginnings are almost entirely dark. There's no surviving birth record, No confident royal family tree connecting her to a known lineage. The leading theory among historians suggests she was the daughter of a powerful court official named Ai, a man who spent decades advising kings, and who, astonishingly, would go on to become pharaoh himself in his old age. An older idea, once fashionable, proposed that she was a foreign princess, sent to Egypt from some distant kingdom to seal a political alliance, though most scholars today have largely abandoned that theory. What we can say with some confidence is that she rose from the very highest tier of Egyptian nobility, close enough to the throne that she would eventually sit beside it. Everything past that is educated guesswork dressed up in academic language. It's worth pausing to appreciate just how strange this is. We're talking about one of the most depicted women in the entire ancient world, a queen carved into temple walls, immortalized in a bust recognized by millions of people who have never opened a history book in their lives, and her parents amount to little more than a shrug. It's the equivalent of the modern world knowing every detail of a global celebrity's face, while having absolutely no idea who raised them or where they grew up. The strongest candidate for her father, the courtier Ai, is himself a fascinating and slightly suspicious figure. He held a string of important titles across multiple reigns, moved easily through the shifting currents of palace politics, and had a habit of surviving political turmoil that would make a modern career diplomat weep with envy. The fact that he eventually claimed the throne himself, despite having no royal blood of his own, tells us he was a man of enormous influence and, quite possibly, flexible loyalties. If Nefertiti really was his daughter, then she came from a family that understood, with real precision, how to stay close to power no matter who happened to be sitting on the throne at any given moment. The foreign princess theory, meanwhile, has fallen out of favor for a fairly simple reason. It was once tempting to imagine that a name as lovely as Nefertiti hinted at some exotic, faraway origin, perhaps a bride sent across borders to cement an alliance. But her name is thoroughly, unmistakably Egyptian, and the beautiful one has arrived, reads far more naturally as a phrase said over a newborn than as a label pinned on an imported bride. Most historians today picture her as homegrown Egyptian nobility, raised entirely within her own country. There's also the curious matter of a woman named Te, described in surviving inscriptions as Nefertiti's nurse, rather than her mother. This one small detail has launched more academic debate than you might expect. Why would a queen of this stature have her childhood nurse commemorated in stone, rather than her birth mother? Perhaps her real mother died young. Perhaps Te was a stepmother, the wife of Ai raising a child who wasn't biologically her own. Every possible explanation opens another door, and every one of those doors leads, frustratingly, to another shrug. What emerges from all this uncertainty isn't a total blank, it's more of a silhouette. Whoever her parents truly were, Nefertiti clearly came from the innermost circle of Egyptian society, the small handful of families who orbited the royal household. Nobody married the heir to the throne of the most powerful kingdom on earth by being a nobody. She had status. She had connections, and she almost certainly came from a family with its own long-term ambitions for her future. That might be the most revealing clue of all. In a world where elite marriages functioned as tools of political strategy, a girl this well-positioned was a valuable asset long before anyone knew what she would eventually become. Her family, it seems, was playing a long game, and Nefertiti was their best piece on the board. So while we can't confidently name her mother, and we can't point to the house where she was born, we can say with some certainty that she was born into real influence and raised with real purpose. What that upbringing actually looked like, day to day, is our next quiet mystery to unravel. Because her origins are so poorly documented, her childhood is almost entirely lost to us as well. And yet we can sketch a reasonable outline, based on what we know about noble Egyptian girls of similar rank. She would have grown up in genuine comfort, surrounded by household servants, shielded from the brutal desert sun, her days scented faintly with lotus blossom and burning incense. If she was raised anywhere near the royal court, She may well have received an education most children of her era could never have dreamed of: learning to read, learning to carry herself with practiced poise, learning the quiet rituals and etiquette that defined power in her world. The Egyptian sun does not compromise, and a wealthy household was built, quite literally, around escaping it. Thick mud brick walls kept interior rooms cool. High, narrow windows let in soft light while blocking out the worst of the midday heat. Shaded courtyards offered a place of retreat when the sun climbed to its most punishing point. For a privileged child, life would have moved in rhythm with that sun, bright and active in the cool mornings and evenings, quiet and sheltered through the scorching hours in between. Comfort in her world meant things most Egyptians could only imagine from a distance. Clean, finely woven linen instead of coarse, rough cloth. Servants to fetch water, prepare meals, and maintain the household. Private pools and gardens where the wealthy could cool themselves during the hottest months. Bread and beer formed the foundation of every Egyptian table, rich and poor alike. But a noble child would also have known the taste of honey, fresh fruit, fish, and roasted meat, luxuries a farming family might see only a handful of times a year. She would have grown up soft, in the specific way that only genuine privilege allows, and in ancient Egypt, that softness was itself a kind of status symbol, a visible marker of rank. Then there's the matter of education, and here noble girls occupied an unusually favorable position by the standards of the ancient world. Egypt was, in general, more generous toward women than most civilizations of its era, allowing them to own property, operate businesses, and appear as legal persons in their own right in official records. A girl of Nefertiti's standing may well have been taught to read and write, a skill that even a great many Egyptian men never acquired. She would have absorbed the etiquette expected of the elite, the correct way to walk, to speak, to hold herself in a room full of powerful people. The countless small performances that marked someone as belonging to the highest circles of society. Beauty itself would have been treated as a discipline to be studied, not a gift left to chance. From a young age, she would likely have learned the specific arts of adornment that Egyptian nobility prized so highly: the careful lining of the eyes with kohl, the protection of skin against the drying desert wind, the wearing of fine jewelry and delicate cloth. This wasn't vanity for its own sake. Appearance signaled rank in a very literal sense, and a noble daughter was, in effect, a walking advertisement for her family's importance and wealth. Through all of it, whether anyone said the words aloud or not, she was being prepared. Girls of her social standing existed, in the cold logic of the age, partly as instruments of political alliance. A well-raised, well-connected, beautiful daughter functioned as a kind of bridge between powerful families, a way of securing futures and binding fortunes together. Every lesson in posture, every hour of careful education, every moment spent learning to command a room, was in some sense an investment with an expected return. It's a strange thing to picture, a small girl playing in a shaded courtyard, unaware that unseen hands were quietly shaping her toward a destiny none of them could have foreseen. They were preparing her, most likely, for an advantageous marriage into another powerful family. What they ultimately got instead was a religious revolution, and one of the most recognizable faces in the entire history of the world. But before any of that could happen, there was a young prince waiting in the wings of the royal court, unusual, intense, and about to change everything. Every great story needs its second half, and hers arrives in the form of a prince named Amenhotep, the fourth Egyptian king to carry that name. He was not the expected heir. An older brother had been raised and groomed to inherit the throne, and when that brother died young, the crown passed instead to a second son who was, by every surviving account, deeply unusual. Ancient depictions show him with a strangely elongated face, a long jaw, wide hips, and a body unlike any pharaoh carved before him. Whether this reflects physical reality or a deliberate artistic choice remains a subject of real scholarly debate. What we can say with confidence is that this odd, intensely spiritual young man was about to become the single most disruptive king in the entirety of Egyptian history, and that Nefertiti was about to become his wife. Consider, for a moment, his position before any of that happened. He was the spare, not the heir, a second son who grew up entirely in the shadow of an older brother destined for the throne. Being the backup royal is a strange kind of existence in any era of history. Important enough to matter, unimportant enough to be overlooked, raised in total luxury but never quite groomed for the top job. And then, suddenly, his brother died and everything changed at once. The overlooked second son found himself, virtually overnight, standing next in line to rule the most powerful kingdom on the face of the earth. His father was Amenhotep III, a king whose reign had been long, prosperous, and dazzling by almost any measure. The elder Amenhotep built on a genuinely monumental scale, filled the land with statues bearing his own likeness, and enjoyed the full fruits of an empire operating at the very peak of its power. He was, in modern terms, an extraordinarily hard act to follow, the kind of towering predecessor who leaves an heir with enormous shoes to fill, and very little room left over to make a name for himself. Any son of his would have felt real pressure to measure up. And this particular son would eventually respond to that pressure in the most unexpected way imaginable. Then there's the puzzle of his physical appearance. Surviving images from his reign show him with a genuinely unusual body, a narrow, elongated face and skull, a soft, rounded belly, wide hips and thighs, and notably thin limbs. For generations, scholars have argued over what this actually means. Did he really look this way, perhaps due to some underlying medical condition? Was it a deliberate artistic style meant to visually separate him from every king who came before him? Or was it a kind of spiritual statement, a way of presenting the king as something beyond ordinary human categories, both male and female at once, a living vessel of divine creative power? Honestly, we don't know, and the debate shows absolutely no sign of settling anytime soon. What comes through clearly, regardless of how he actually looked, is his intensity. This was not a calm, ceremonial king content to simply keep the existing machinery running smoothly. He was a man consumed by ideas, particularly religious ones, occupying a role that had traditionally rewarded caution, continuity, and respect for tradition above almost everything else. Where his ancestors had honored the gods through dutiful, predictable ritual, he seems to have burned with a personal, almost obsessive vision of his own. That is a genuinely dangerous quality in an absolute ruler, the kind of trait that can produce either greatness or catastrophe, and sometimes, unnervingly, both at the same time. It's tempting to wonder what the royal court made of him as a young man. A strangely built second son, suddenly elevated to the position of heir, quiet and inward, and clearly not especially interested in doing things the way they had always been done. One imagines a great many nobles and senior priests quietly reassuring one another that he would settle down once the crown was actually on his head, that the old traditions were simply too ancient, too deeply rooted, to be threatened by one unusual young man's private convictions. They were, as history would go on to prove, spectacularly wrong. Into the life of this strange, restless prince came Nefertiti, and whatever arrangements lay behind their union, the partnership that followed would become one of the most consequential relationships in the entire ancient world. Their marriage is where the real revolution begins. Their union was almost certainly arranged, as all royal marriages of the era were, a matter of political alliance and dynastic strategy rather than anything resembling romance. Nefertiti became the wife of Amenhotep IV while both of them were still remarkably young, and from the very beginning, something set this particular royal couple apart from everyone who had come before them. Egyptian art had, for centuries, followed a strict and unspoken rule. The king stood at the center of every scene, towering and dominant, while his queen appeared as a small figure near his feet, present but clearly secondary. In the earliest images of this new couple, though, Nefertiti appears again and again at nearly the same scale as her husband, standing beside him, not behind him, sharing his light rather than existing in its shadow. Whatever the political calculations behind the wedding itself, The partnership that emerged from it would prove to be one of the strangest and most unusual in the ancient world. It's important not to romanticize the arrangement at its outset. Royal marriage in the ancient world was a contract negotiated by powerful families with a close eye on property, bloodlines, and political leverage. Nobody consulted the feelings of the young couple involved, and the entire notion of marrying purely for love would have struck the negotiating parties as charmingly naive, roughly as sensible to them, as choosing a business partner based on their favorite color. This was, in every practical sense, a merger, and Nefertiti was both a bride and a carefully positioned strategic asset. And yet what happened after the contracts were, so to speak, finalized is where the story becomes genuinely surprising. Egyptian royal art had operated under strict, unbending rules for well over 1,000 years. The pharaoh was always the towering figure, the visual center of gravity in every scene. Queens appeared, certainly, but small, often shown at a literal fraction of the king's physical size, a form of visual grammar everyone in Egyptian society understood instinctively. Big meant important, small meant secondary. And then, quite suddenly, this pair arrives on the scene, and the old grammar begins to break down entirely. Nefertiti is shown large. She stands beside the king rather than trailing behind him. She appears scene after scene as something close to an equal, a partner in the visual sense just as much as the political one. To an Egyptian eye trained on centuries of unbroken convention, this would have felt genuinely startling, not unlike opening a familiar, formal document and discovering it had been rewritten in an entirely new alphabet. The message being sent was unmistakable. This queen was not a footnote to her husband's reign. We should be careful, of course, not to project a distinctly modern love story onto 3,000-year-old carved stone. The intimacy visible in their imagery may reflect genuine personal affection, or it may reflect deliberate theology, a calculated presentation of the royal couple as a divine pair, essential to the new religious vision that was already beginning to take shape. It's entirely possible it was both at once. Genuine feeling and calculated political messaging are not mutually exclusive, as anyone who has ever watched a modern power couple work a crowded room could easily attest. What we can say with real confidence is that Nefertiti was being positioned, from very early in the marriage, as something far more significant than a decorative royal wife. Their youth adds an extra layer of drama to the picture. Both of them were likely still teenagers, or barely beyond that age, when they married. Two very young people suddenly handed the reins of a global superpower, and a shared destiny that neither one of them could have fully grasped at the time. There's something almost dizzying about it. A couple this young, holding this much unchecked power, with no cautious older hand firmly steering them away from radical ideas. More experienced, more conservative rulers might well have been talked out of what came next. These two, it seems, leaned directly into it, because what followed was not the quiet, conventional reign of feasts and building projects that the court had every reason to expect and welcome. What followed was upheaval, a deliberate assault on the oldest traditions in the land, with Nefertiti standing prominently at her husband's side through every step of it. The marriage that began life as a strategic political arrangement was quietly becoming the engine of a genuine revolution. And her first major step into that expanded role arrived with a title, one that carried far more weight than anyone at court likely realized at the time. With marriage came a title heavy with meaning, Great Royal Wife, the highest formal rank a woman could hold anywhere in Egypt. It made her the chief queen among any other royal wives her husband might take, positioned her as mother of the primary royal line, and cast her as a living link between the king and the divine order he represented. But Nefertiti appears to have taken this role and pushed it far beyond simple ceremony. Surviving inscriptions and images suggest she was granted honors and formal titles rarely, if ever, given to an Egyptian queen before her. She was not simply the woman standing beside the throne. She was becoming, in a very real sense, a structural pillar of the entire reign, and the reign she was helping to support was about to turn the whole kingdom upside down. The title itself was never a mere courtesy, the ancient equivalent of a polite anniversary card. It was a genuine office, carrying genuine spiritual weight. Egyptian kings frequently took multiple wives, but only one woman at a time could hold this supreme rank. She was the queen, the one whose children stood first in the line of succession, the one entrusted with a sacred role in the rituals that bound the monarchy to the gods it represented. To hold this title was to stand, quite literally, at the summit of every woman in the kingdom. Even against that already lofty standard, Nefertiti went further still. She began accumulating additional names and honorific titles, strings of formal praise attached to her that steadily elevated her status well beyond that of a typical royal wife. These titles piled up like a growing list of accolades, each one nudging her a little higher, a little closer to her husband's own exalted position. In a culture that believed words carved permanently into stone carried genuine, lasting power, this steady accumulation of grand titles was never idle flattery. It was a deliberate, calculated raising of her official standing, made permanent, made official, made eternal. It helps here to understand just how deeply Egyptians believed in the power of names and images. To them, writing something down or carving it into a temple wall was never mere record-keeping. It made the thing real. And kept it real forever, in this world and the next. A person's name was considered a genuine piece of their soul, and to have that name displayed grandly and repeatedly was to be magnified, both in life and in the afterlife that followed it. So when Nefertiti's names and titles multiplied across the monuments of Egypt, it meant she was being written, quite literally, into the divine order of the universe on a scale almost unheard of for any queen before her. There's a temptation, looking back at all this, to imagine a woman scheming and clawing her way toward power. But the more likely truth is subtler, and honestly more interesting. This appears to have been a genuine partnership, and Nefertiti's elevation seems to have formed part of a shared vision she was building together with her husband. He needed her exalted, because the new religious order they were about to create would place the royal couple together at its sacred center. Her rise wasn't a rebellion against the king's authority. It was, in effect, the king's own design. That said, occupying a role like this clearly required a very particular kind of woman. Titles can be handed out freely enough, but genuine presence cannot be manufactured. Everything we can see from this period suggests Nefertiti had the bearing to match her honors, the ability to stand in the full, blinding glare of royal ceremony and genuinely belong there. A weaker figure would almost certainly have been swallowed whole by the sheer grandeur of it all. She, by every surviving indication, wore it as though it had been custom-made for her, which, in a very real sense, it had been. So here she stood, great royal wife decorated with unprecedented honors, magnified permanently in stone, elevated to a status few queens before her had ever known. And all of this was unfolding in the traditional religious heart of Egypt, in the ancient capital where the old gods had reigned, unquestioned for well over 1,000 years. To properly picture the world she now moved through, we need to walk through the palace gates ourselves, into the incense and grandeur of the royal court at Thebes, where beneath all that splendor, a storm was quietly gathering. Before the great upheaval, the royal couple made their home in Thebes, the magnificent religious capital of Egypt. Here, the temples of Amen rose in dense forests of painted stone columns, and the priesthood attached to them wielded influence that genuinely rivaled the crown itself. For Nefertiti, life at court meant a world built entirely around ritual and splendor, a constant rhythm of processions and religious festivals, a court where every single gesture carried weight and meaning. And yet beneath all the incense and ceremony, tension was steadily building. The young king was growing visibly restless with the old religious order, increasingly uneasy with the vast, unchecked power held by Amen's priesthood, and a queen as perceptive as Nefertiti would surely have felt the ground beginning to shift beneath the polished temple floors. Thebes was a city deliberately built to overwhelm the senses. Its great temples were designed to make any human visitor feel genuinely small in the presence of the divine, with columns so massive that a small group of people could comfortably stand atop just one of them, painted in brilliant colors and crowned with towering images of gods and kings. Walking through such a space, dwarfed by stone giants, wrapped in curling incense smoke, was meant to inspire something close to awe bordering on fear. It was theater on a genuinely colossal scale, and the audience was the entire kingdom. Court life within this world moved to the steady rhythm of religious ritual. There were festivals that filled the city streets with processions, sacred statues carried through crowds on gilded ceremonial boats, music and offerings everywhere, crowds pressing forward for a glimpse of the divine passing by. There were ceremonies marking the changing seasons, the annual flooding of the Nile, the great eternal cycle that kept all of Egypt alive and fed. For the royal family, participating in all of this was never optional relaxation. It was the actual job, the constant, very public performance of their sacred role, the visible proof to the entire kingdom that the cosmos remained in good, capable hands. For Nefertiti specifically, this meant a life lived largely on public display. As great royal wife, she would have appeared at every major royal occasion, richly dressed and adorned, playing her carefully choreographed part in the endless ceremony of monarchy. Behind the scenes, there would have been comfort beyond almost anything we can easily imagine today, palaces staffed by armies of servants, private gardens and cooling pools, the very finest food and cloth available anywhere in the ancient world. But her public self was always on display, always performing the dignity and near divinity expected of someone holding her exalted rank. It was privilege and pressure, tightly braided together into a single existence. And presiding over the spiritual life of the entire kingdom were the priests of Amen, whose power had grown to genuinely uncomfortable proportions. Across generations of royal gifts and religious offerings, they had accumulated enormous wealth and vast tracts of land, becoming a force no king could simply afford to ignore. They controlled the rituals. They controlled the temples. They controlled the vast administrative machinery of the state religion itself. In practical terms, they functioned as a rival center of political power, a permanent institution that outlasted any individual king's reign, quietly shaping the kingdom around its own long-term interests. It doesn't take much imagination to see how this arrangement might have grated on a young, intense, deeply spiritual king. Here was a ruler who genuinely believed himself to be the living link between the gods and humanity, and yet an entire class of priests stood between him and the divine, growing steadily richer and more influential in the process. For a man convinced he held a special, personal relationship with the sacred, the whole arrangement may have felt not merely frustrating, but fundamentally wrong, an obstacle standing directly between himself and the truth as he understood it. Nefertiti, sharp and observant as she clearly was, would surely have sensed all of this building around her. A queen positioned this close to the throne, elevated this high, does not miss the currents running beneath the surface of her own court. She would have watched her husband's restlessness grow month by month, felt the mounting tension between crown and temple, and understood, perhaps before almost anyone else, that something significant was coming. The old order, so ancient, so seemingly permanent, was about to face a challenge unlike anything in its long, unbroken history. And that challenge began with a single, radical idea about the true nature of God itself. Then came the idea that would define everything that followed. Amenhotep IV began to elevate a single deity above every other god in the Egyptian pantheon, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun itself. This wasn't an entirely new god pulled from nowhere. The Aten had existed in Egyptian religious thought for some time already. But under this particular king, the Aten was raised to genuinely dizzying heights, worshipped not as one power among many, but as the ultimate source of all life itself. In time, the king would go further still, declaring this sun disk the one true god worthy of devotion. In a land that had honored hundreds of different deities for thousands of years, this was nothing short of a full religious revolution, and Nefertiti stood directly at its center. To grasp just how shocking this idea really was, you have to understand how ordinary Egyptians thought about their gods. They didn't worship one deity, or even a tidy handful. They lived alongside a vast, sprawling crowd of gods, hundreds of them, governing everything from the sun to the annual harvest to childbirth to the dangers lurking in the open desert. Different cities favored different local gods. Individual temples honored their own particular patron deities. And the whole rich, tangled system had grown organically over literally thousands of years. It functioned less like a religion in the modern, tidy sense, and more like an entire ecosystem of the sacred. Into this crowded and ancient heaven, the king proposed something genuinely outrageous. Not a new god to simply add to the existing pile, but the elevation of a single deity above all the rest, and eventually the insistence that this one god was the only one that mattered at all. The Aten was the sun disk itself, the physical, visible sun blazing overhead every single day, the obvious source of all warmth, light, and life on Earth. It was, in a very real sense, a god you could actually see with your own eyes, day after day. No hidden statue required. No dark inner sanctuary needed to house it. There's a striking simplicity in the choice itself. The old gods typically had elaborate physical forms, human bodies fused with animal heads, complex mythologies, mysterious identities known only through statues and oral tradition. The Aten, by stark contrast, was depicted as a plain, unadorned disk hanging in the sky, its rays reaching down toward the earth and ending in small, delicate hands that offered the symbol of life directly to the royal family below. No hawk's head, no cow's horns, no crocodile snout. Just pure sunlight radiating life onto the world. It was almost austere in its clarity, and that clarity appears to have been very much the point. What made this genuinely revolutionary, rather than merely eccentric, was the exclusivity that eventually followed. Egyptians were entirely comfortable adding new gods to their existing pantheon, or shifting emphasis between different deities over time. What they were far less comfortable with was the suggestion that all the other gods should simply be pushed aside, their temples neglected, their ancient rituals abandoned outright. Favoring one god above others was perfectly ordinary. Insisting that a single god eclipsed all the rest struck directly at the foundation of how Egyptians understood the entire universe. It threatened the delicate cosmic balance they believed kept reality itself from sliding into chaos. And crucially, in this new theology, the Aten spoke only to the royal family. Ordinary Egyptians could not commune with the sun disk directly. They could only reach it through the king and his queen, who alone occupied that sacred, intermediary position. In one elegant theological move, this cut the powerful priests of Amen out of the equation entirely and placed all spiritual authority directly in the hands of the royal couple. It was theology and raw political calculation fused into a single blazing idea, and it happened to make the king and queen the sole gateway to God himself. Nefertiti was no passive bystander to any of this. She appears constantly in the worship of the Aten, standing at her husband's side, forming part of a sacred trio alongside the sun and the king. This revolution was never his alone. From the very beginning, it belonged to both of them. And a revolution this bold couldn't remain a private matter of personal royal preference for very long. It was about to reshape the king's own identity, beginning with the most fundamental thing any person carries, his own name. To match his new religious conviction, the king cast off his own identity entirely. He abandoned the name Amenhotep, which literally honored the god Amen, and became Akhenaten, a name meaning something close to one who is effective on behalf of the Aten. It was a stunning public declaration. A pharaoh had renamed himself in service to a single deity, and in doing so, had turned his back publicly on the mightiest priesthood in the entire kingdom. Nefertiti embraced this new order right alongside him. Her own name later expanded to include a direct tribute to the Aten. Together, they were no longer simply rulers of Egypt. They had become, in effect, prophets of a new and jealous sun god. Think for a moment about what a name actually meant to an ancient Egyptian. It wasn't a casual label. It was a core piece of a person's very being, bound up tightly with their soul and their fate in both this life and the next. To change your name was to change your fundamental essence, to declare yourself remade from the ground up. And the king's original birth name, Amenhotep, literally carried the name of Amen inside it, the very god whose priesthood he was coming to resent so deeply. Every single time his name was spoken aloud, it quietly honored the deity he now sought to eclipse entirely. So he simply did away with it. He became Akhenaten, weaving the Aten directly into his own identity, announcing to the entire kingdom that he now belonged wholly and completely to the sun disk. It's genuinely difficult to overstate how pointed this gesture was. Imagine a modern ruler whose very name honored the dominant institution of his age, publicly discarding that name to embrace a rival cause instead. It was a break so clean, so deliberate, that no one at court could possibly mistake its meaning. The king had chosen a side, and the side he chose stood in direct opposition to the priesthood that had run Egypt's spiritual life for a millennium. Nefertiti, ever the partner in all of this, adjusted her own name in turn. She adopted an expanded form that wove the Aten directly into her own identity, just as her husband had done with his. This was no small administrative footnote. It was the queen publicly aligning her very self with the revolution, declaring in the most personal terms imaginable that she stood fully with the new faith. The royal couple were now, quite literally, named for the sun. The audacity of it all would have landed like an actual thunderclap among the priests of Amen. For generations, they had felt entirely secure in their power, wealthy, influential, woven inseparably into the fabric of the Egyptian state. Now the king himself had scrubbed their god's very name from his own identity and thrown his full royal weight behind a rival deity. It was a declaration of intent that no amount of polite diplomatic reassurance could possibly soften. There's something almost breathtaking about the sheer confidence this required. This wasn't some fringe religious figure or a rebel with nothing left to lose. This was the pharaoh himself, the living god-king, the traditional guardian of a religious system thousands of years old, choosing quite deliberately to detonate that entire tradition and rebuild it around a single new idea. Most rulers cling to their legitimacy by carefully honoring everything that came before them. Akhenaten sought his own legitimacy by breaking with it completely, staking absolutely everything on the truth of his new vision. And Nefertiti was bound to that enormous gamble completely. Her name, her public image, her sacred religious role, all of it now flowed directly from the Aten and the revolution it represented. There was no quiet exit available to her, no way to hedge her position and wait to see how things turned out. She had committed herself fully and visibly to a course that had already made the most powerful religious institution in the land into a bitter enemy. And the old gods, along with their furious, sidelined priests, were not going to simply accept this lying down. That brewing conflict between the radical new faith of the royal couple and the wounded, resentful guardians of the old religious order was about to sharpen into something approaching open confrontation. Revolutions tend to make powerful enemies, and this one was no exception. As the royal court poured its favor and its resources into the worship of the Aten, the temples of Amen and every other traditional god watched their wealth and influence steadily drain away. The priesthood that had grown so wealthy over centuries of continuous offerings suddenly found itself sidelined by a king who no longer had any use for their services. Later in his reign, Akhenaten would go even further, ordering the names of the old gods physically chiseled out of monuments across the entire kingdom. For the priests of Amen, this amounted to nothing short of catastrophe. For Nefertiti and her husband, it was a bridge deliberately burned beyond any hope of repair, leaving them no real choice but to build something entirely new to stand on. To appreciate the true scale of the offense here, it helps to remember exactly what these temples represented in practical terms. They weren't merely places of quiet worship. They were vast economic engines in their own right, holding enormous tracts of land, stores of grain, herds of livestock, and accumulated treasure, employing entire armies of workers, scribes, and skilled craftsmen. The Temple of Amen at Thebes ranked among the wealthiest single institutions anywhere in the ancient world. When the crown began redirecting its resources toward the Aten instead, this wasn't simply a spiritual insult. It was cutting off the lifeblood of an entire economic sector. Picture the priesthood watching all of this unfold in real time. For generations, they had enjoyed genuine security, prestige, and a comfortable certainty that their position was essentially permanent. Now a young king was deliberately starving their temples of royal support, elevating a rival god above them, and making it unmistakably clear that their services were no longer required at court. It would have felt to them like watching a thriving family business quietly dismantled by an heir who had simply decided the entire enterprise was a mistake from the start. The resentment building underneath the surface must have been enormous, even if it had to be swallowed in careful, public silence. Then came the truly radical step. Akhenaten didn't merely neglect the old gods and let them fade quietly from public life. He moved to actively erase them. Workers were dispatched to hack the name of Amen out of inscriptions across the kingdom, chiseling it from monuments wherever it appeared. In a culture that genuinely believed a name carved into stone was a living, eternal thing, this was an act of real and calculated aggression. To destroy a god's name was, in the Egyptian worldview, to attack the god itself, an attempt to unmake a divine being that had been honored continuously for well over 1,000 years. The obsession apparently ran so deep that even the plural word for gods was reportedly targeted in places, as though the very concept of multiple deities had become offensive to the new religious order. This was not gentle reform or a subtle softening of religious emphasis. It was a genuine campaign, methodical, sustained, and clearly determined to reshape the entire spiritual landscape of Egypt by force. One imagines teams of workers moving steadily from temple to temple, chisels in hand, defacing the sacred history of their own civilization on the direct orders of a king who had become convinced that he alone understood the truth. For Nefertiti and Akhenaten, all of this closed off any real possibility of retreat. You cannot chisel a beloved, ancient god out of 1,000 monuments and then quietly change your mind a few years later. They had made permanent, highly visible enemies of the single most powerful religious institution in the land, and they had done so in a way that could never fully be undone. The old order was not going to forgive this, and everyone at court surely understood as much. Having burned the bridge this thoroughly, they had effectively committed themselves to the far shore, which meant they now needed to build something solid to stand on. A revolution that only tears down eventually collapses into pure destruction unless it also constructs something new. And so, having rejected the ancient religious capital and its furious priesthood, the royal couple needed an entirely new stage. A place untouched by the old gods, where their sun disk could reign without rival. Akhenaten conceived one of the most ambitious building projects of the entire ancient world, a brand new capital city, raised from empty desert, and build it he did. Akhenaten decided that his new god deserved an entirely new home, a capital untouched by the old faith in any way. So he selected an empty stretch of desert on the eastern bank of the Nile, roughly halfway between Egypt's two traditional power centers, and there, on virgin ground, he raised an entire city from nothing. He named it Akhetaten, meaning the horizon of the Aten. Boundary markers were carved directly into the surrounding cliffs to mark the city's sacred limits. Palaces, open-air temples, homes, and workshops rose out of the sand at genuinely astonishing speed. It stands as one of the boldest urban projects anywhere in the ancient world, an entire capital built almost overnight, in service of a single glowing idea. The choice of location was itself a deliberate statement. Akhenaten didn't simply expand an existing city or repurpose some older religious center for his purposes. He wanted ground with absolutely no history attached to it, no ancestral temples, no lingering presence of the old gods anywhere nearby. So he chose a site with no established patron deity, and declared that here, on this untouched earth, his god had personally chosen to dwell. It was a blank page, and he clearly intended to write his entire vision across it in stone. To mark the sacred boundaries of this new realm, he had enormous inscriptions carved directly into the surrounding cliff faces. These boundary markers weren't simple signposts. They recorded his personal vision, his devotion to the Aten, and his solemn public commitment to build his new capital precisely here, and nowhere else. In a sense, he was drawing a kind of magical circle in the open desert, defining a holy space and swearing to fill it with a capital worthy of his sun god. The ambition on display here is genuinely dizzying, a king willing an entire world into existence through sheer royal decree. Then came the actual physical labor involved. Building a city from absolutely nothing meant hauling stone, molding countless mud bricks, cutting timber, and organizing an enormous workforce on a genuinely massive scale. Temples had to rise. Palaces had to be constructed. Storehouses, private homes, roads, and craft workshops all needed to appear where, only moments before in historical terms, there had been nothing but sand and bare rock. The sheer speed at which this was accomplished tells us something important about both the resources Egypt commanded and the sheer intensity of the king's personal will. When a living god decides he wants a new city, apparently, the city gets built, and built quickly. The temples themselves broke sharply with tradition, in a way that captured the entire spirit of the religious revolution. The old temples of Egypt had been dark, enclosed, and deliberately mysterious, their innermost sanctuaries hidden away from ordinary eyes and reserved exclusively for trained priests. The temples of the Aten were built to be the exact opposite. They stood open to the sky, deliberately roofless in their most sacred inner spaces, so that sunlight could pour directly down onto the altars and offerings below. Worship here happened in the full, unfiltered blaze of the god itself, out in the open air, bathed constantly in natural light. It was architecture functioning as theology, the building itself quietly preaching the new faith to everyone who walked through it. There's something both magnificent and slightly unhinged about the entire enterprise. To conjure an entire functioning capital city out of empty desert, purely to serve a single religious idea, is the act of a ruler utterly convinced of his own vision, and largely unconcerned with either the cost or the risk involved. For a time, remarkably, it worked. But cities built entirely on the private will of one visionary tend to share that visionary's ultimate fate, and this particular city would prove no exception to that pattern. For now, though, the impossible had genuinely been achieved. A gleaming new capital stood ready in the middle of the desert, fully dedicated to the sun. All that remained was for the royal court to move in, and so the entire government of Egypt prepared to abandon the ancient heart of the kingdom and follow their king out to the horizon of the Aten. When the new city was finally ready, the royal court simply picked up its entire operation and left the ancient capital behind for good. Nefertiti, Akhenaten, their growing family, their officials, their household servants, and their skilled artisans, all of them migrated together to this shining new home rising out of the desert. Try to imagine the sheer scale of it. An entire functioning government relocating to a place with no history, no ancestral tombs nearby, no old temples standing anywhere close, nothing but fresh mud brick and the relentless desert sun overhead. For everyone who made that journey, it must have felt genuinely like stepping into a strange, unfamiliar new world. And at the very heart of that world, radiant in every surviving image, stood the queen. Moving an entire royal court was nothing like packing up an ordinary household. It meant transplanting the whole apparatus of a functioning superpower. The administrators who kept tax records and managed state finances, the scribes who handled diplomatic correspondence with foreign kings, the priests of the new faith, the craftsmen and artists who would go on to decorate the fresh temples and palaces, the household servants who cooked and cleaned and hauled water, and the countless laborers required to keep any new city functioning day to day. All of them uprooted at once and carried out to a patch of desert that had been empty land not long before. For the nobles and officials involved, the move was almost certainly a mixture of genuine opportunity and quiet unease. To follow the king out to his new capital was to signal absolute loyalty, and to position oneself close to the center of power during this bold new era. But it also meant leaving behind established homes, family burial sites, and the familiar comforts of the older, established cities. Egyptian identity was deeply tied to place and to ancestry, and abandoning the traditional centers of power for a raw new city built in the middle of nowhere would have unsettled even the most devoted courtier. Ambition and anxiety, it seems, traveled together on that long road out to the new capital. Consider, too, everything the new city necessarily lacked, precisely because it was so new. There were no ancient shrines where one's ancestors had once worshipped, no venerable tombs holding the honored dead, none of the accumulated historical weight that made the older capitals feel eternal and secure. Everything here was fresh, unweathered, entirely untested by time. For a civilization that drew enormous comfort from continuity and permanence, life in a brand new city must have carried a faint but persistent strangeness, something like living in a house where the paint hasn't quite finished drying, and nobody around you has yet grown old within its walls. And yet, for a time, it genuinely worked. The city filled steadily with life. The court settled comfortably into its new palaces. The open-air temples rang continuously with the worship of the Aten. The whole grand experiment took on every appearance of real, lasting success. The royal family, finally freed from the long shadow of the old priesthood, could now live and rule entirely within a world of their own making. Inside this sun-drenched capital, their religious vision wasn't a rebellious idea competing against older ones. It was simply reality, the only reality this particular city had ever known. At the center of it all, once again, stood Nefertiti. The art produced in this new capital shows her constantly worshiping the sun, riding in chariots, embracing her young daughters, standing beside her husband at every major occasion. She appears radiant, prominent, genuinely impossible to overlook. Whatever else this strange new world may have been, it was unmistakably a place where the queen shone with extraordinary brightness, her image woven directly into the city's own sense of identity. She was never a distant background figure here. She was one of its living emblems, life in this new capital, known to us today by its modern name, Amarna, unfolded across sprawling palaces and sun-filled courtyards. Unlike the dark, incense-heavy temples of the old religious order, the temples of the Aten stood open to the sky, allowing sunlight to fall directly onto the altars below. The royal family lived surrounded by private gardens, cooling pools, painted floors, and colorful walls decorated with vivid scenes drawn from the natural world. And yet a desert city inevitably has its harsher edges too. Archaeological evidence suggests that while the royal family enjoyed genuine splendor, the laborers who actually built their paradise endured a considerably grimmer existence. Even in a city devoted entirely to light, shadows still gathered at its margins. The royal palaces of Amarna were designed specifically for beauty and comfort within a genuinely brutal climate. Cool interior rooms offered welcome refuge from the desert heat, while private gardens and pools brought precious greenery and water into a landscape that offered neither naturally. The wealthy residents of this city could stroll through shaded courtyards, rest beside decorative pools, and enjoy the countless small luxuries that clearly separated them from the harsher world just outside the palace walls. It was, in effect, an artificial oasis conjured entirely through human effort, in a place that offered nothing freely on its own. The interior decoration of these royal spaces broke just as boldly with tradition as everything else about the reign. Where older Egyptian art had tended toward stiff, formal, deliberately eternal scenes, the walls and floors of Amarna burst with movement and life. Painted marshes, birds caught mid-flight, plants swaying gently in an implied breeze, animals frozen in motion, all rendered with a fluid naturalism that must have felt genuinely fresh and alive at the time. To walk through these rooms was to be surrounded on every side by images of the living, sunlit world, a fitting setting for a family that had built its entire religion around worshipping the sun as the ultimate source of life. The religious heart of the city, the temples of the Aten themselves, made this new theology impossible to ignore for even a moment. Gone were the shadowy inner sanctuaries of the old faith, the hidden chambers accessible only to trained priests. Instead, the sacred spaces here opened directly to the sky, so that offerings could be made in the full, unfiltered light of the sun disk itself. Worship in this new capital was a thing of brightness and openness, conducted directly beneath the very god being honored. The architecture itself insisted, at every turn, that the divine was never hidden away, but blazing openly overhead for absolutely everyone to feel. But no honest account of this radiant city would be complete without acknowledging its darker margins as well. Beyond the palaces and temples lay the ordinary residential districts, and beyond even those, the far grimmer quarters that housed the laborers who had actually built the royal dream with their own hands. Archaeological study of skeletal remains found at Amarna paints a genuinely sobering picture. Many of the workers appear to have suffered from hard physical labor, chronic poor nutrition, and the injuries and illnesses that inevitably came with grinding toil under a relentless desert sun. The paradise enjoyed by the few had been razed, quite literally, on the backs of the many. This is the quiet, uncomfortable truth sitting just beneath the glittering surface of Amarna. The city of light, devoted to a god supposedly pouring life equally onto everyone below him, was in daily practice just as unequal as any other city in the ancient world. The royal family enjoyed their gardens and painted halls, while the people who had cut the stone and molded the bricks endured lives that were often short, physically brutal, and frequently painful. It's a familiar pattern that repeats across much of human history. A beautiful vision, built at genuinely terrible cost to the very people who never got to enjoy its benefits. Amid all of this, in the gardens, in the painted rooms, moved Nefertiti, the queen positioned at the dazzling center of court life. And part of what made her so visible, so constantly present in the art of the period, was the way she deliberately presented herself, the careful artistry of her appearance, which helped turn her into an enduring icon recognized even today. No portrait of Nefertiti would be complete without mentioning her legendary beauty, and in ancient Egypt, beauty itself was treated as a serious craft. The dark lines ringing her eyes in the famous surviving bust were kohl, a mineral-based paste worn by nobles and ordinary Egyptians alike, prized both for its dramatic visual effect and for its believed power to guard against the fierce glare of the desert sun. Finely pleated linen, jewelry made of gold and colored stone, elaborate headdresses, and carefully perfumed oils all completed the total image of royalty. Nefertiti became, in many ways, the ultimate embodiment of this entire culture of adornment. Her face preserved so perfectly that it still shapes what many people today picture when they imagine ancient Egyptian elegance. Start with the eyes, because in both Egyptian art and everyday Egyptian life, the eyes were considered everything. Kohl was carefully applied to line and visually extend them, creating that dramatic, elongated look so instantly recognizable across the centuries that followed. This wasn't purely decorative, either. The dark pigment was genuinely believed to reduce the sun's harsh glare, and was thought to offer real protection against the kinds of eye ailments that were extremely common in a hot, dusty environment. So this most famous of ancient cosmetic choices was, in a very real sense, practical, a bit of early sun protection that also happened to look absolutely striking. Then there was the linen itself. Egypt's climate demanded light, breathable clothing, and its skilled weavers produced linen of extraordinary fineness, sometimes woven so sheer and delicate that it was nearly translucent. For the elite, garments were carefully pleated into elegant folds that fell in graceful lines, worn crisp and brilliant white against sun-darkened skin. To wear cloth this finely worked was to advertise one's social status instantly, without needing to say a single word. Coarse, heavy fabric marked an ordinary laborer. Delicate, flowing linen marked a noble. And the very finest cloth of all marked genuine royalty. Jewelry added splashes of vivid color to this world dominated by white linen and gold. Egyptians adored bright, precious materials, gold worked into intricate decorative forms, colored stones and glass, beads in deep blues, greens, and reds strung into broad ceremonial collars, bracelets, and elaborate ornamental pieces. These were never mere trinkets. Precious materials carried real symbolic meaning associated with the gods, protection, and eternal life, so that wearing them functioned as a kind of spiritual armor as much as simple display. A queen decked out in gold and gleaming stone wasn't merely showing off her wealth. She was, in a real sense, clothing herself in the sacred and the enduring. Perfumed oils and carefully chosen scents completed the total effect. And here too there was a practical logic hiding beneath the obvious luxury. In a hot land where regular bathing was highly valued, fragrant oils kept the skin from drying and cracking, softened the harsh effects of sun and wind, and left the wearer wrapped in a pleasant, lingering scent throughout the day. At royal banquets, the wealthy famously wore small cones of perfumed fat balanced atop their heads, which slowly melted throughout the evening, releasing fragrance steadily as the hours passed. Beauty in ancient Egypt engaged nearly every sense at once, sight and scent alike, all carefully and deliberately cultivated. Nefertiti stands today as the supreme embodiment of this entire artistic tradition. Whatever her actual physical features may have looked like in life, the image that survives presents a face of striking balance and quiet serenity, adorned with every ounce of mastery her civilization could bring to bear. She became, in effect, the human ideal of Egyptian beauty, the standard against which our collective imagination still measures the entire age. When people today close their eyes and picture an ancient Egyptian queen, it's very often her face they see, lined delicately with kohl, elaborately crowned, perfectly composed. But it would be a genuine mistake to think of her as merely a beautiful ornament, a lovely decorative face for the reign to display publicly. Behind all that adornment stood a woman of real, substantial power, deeply woven into the strange new religion she and her husband had built together from nothing. To understand that fully, we need to turn from her outward appearance to her actual role in the worship of the sun itself. Nefertiti was no passive wife standing quietly behind a revolutionary king. In the art of Amarna, she appears again and again performing genuinely sacred acts, making offerings to the Aten, raising her arms in worship, taking part in rituals that in earlier eras had belonged exclusively to the pharaoh himself. She functioned, in effect, as a high priestess of this new religion, one of only a small handful of people permitted to commune directly with a god who, according to the theology of the age, spoke only to the royal family. Her spiritual role was never mere decoration. It sat at the very center of the entire system Akhenaten had built, making her genuinely indispensable to the new faith itself. Recall the peculiar structure of this new religion. The Aten did not speak to ordinary Egyptians, and it did not work through a broad, established priesthood in the way the old gods had. Instead, access to the divine flowed exclusively through the royal family. The king, the queen, and their daughters formed a single sacred circle, the sole channel connecting the sun disk to the world below. This was a theology of stunning exclusivity, and it placed Nefertiti not at the margins of the faith, but directly at its beating heart. The surviving images make her prominence completely unmistakable. She's shown making offerings to the Aten, her arms raised, performing acts of worship that under the traditional order would have been the exclusive privilege of the pharaoh alone. For a queen to be depicted this way, actively engaged in the highest sacred functions, rather than merely observing them from the sidelines, was genuinely extraordinary. It signaled that she wasn't simply the king's companion during these rituals, but a real celebrant in her own right, a figure carrying genuine religious authority. This matters enormously, because in Egypt, spiritual authority and political authority were never truly separate. The king's entire claim to power rested on his sacred role as the link between gods and humanity. By sharing so visibly in the worship of the Aten, Nefertiti was sharing directly in that very source of legitimacy. She wasn't merely borrowing a bit of ceremonial dignity for show. She was participating in the foundational function of the monarchy itself, in a religion built entirely around the royal family that made her genuinely load-bearing. There's a neat, if slightly ruthless, logic at work here too. Having stripped the old priesthood of its traditional role, the royal couple needed someone to fill the resulting spiritual vacuum themselves. Someone had to perform the sacred rituals, and the new theology deliberately kept that responsibility within the family. Nefertiti's prominence in worship was therefore never just a personal honor bestowed on her. It was a structural necessity the entire system depended on, and she stepped fully into that demanding role. It's worth savoring, too, how genuinely unusual this was against the long backdrop of Egyptian history. Queens had always carried real religious significance, but rarely, if ever, had one been shown so consistently performing the highest sacred rites, so clearly essential to the actual functioning of the state religion itself. Nefertiti wasn't an accessory to the faith. She was one of its central pillars, without whom the entire delicate structure would very likely have wobbled. Her husband, in effect, had built a religion that could not fully operate without her direct participation. All of this power and public prominence, however, existed alongside a very old and very stubborn pressure that no amount of religious theology could ever fully dissolve. For all her sacred authority, Nefertiti still lived in a world deeply obsessed with royal succession, with the crown passing cleanly from father to son. And on that particular front, the queen faced a difficulty that shadowed even her most radiant years, a matter of daughters, in the absence of a certain kind of heir. For all her power, Nefertiti faced the exact same pressure that has haunted queens across nearly every era of recorded history, the need to produce a male heir. She bore Akhenaten 6 daughters, whose names still ring out across the centuries, among them Rewrote, Akhetaten, and Akhetaten. What she apparently did not bear, at least as far as the surviving records show, was a son who lived long enough to inherit the throne. In a kingdom deeply obsessed with royal succession, this absence carried enormous political weight. And yet, unusually for the era, her daughters were celebrated quite openly, appearing repeatedly in tender family scenes rather than being quietly tucked away out of sight. A clear sign of just how differently this particular royal household chose to present itself to the public. 6 surviving daughters is, by any reasonable measure, a remarkable family, and these girls appear throughout the art of the Amarna period with a frequency that's genuinely striking. Their individual names are recorded. Their images are carefully preserved. Their presence is woven again and again into the visual narrative of the royal household. For a civilization that had often kept royal women pushed into the background of official art, this open, repeated celebration of daughters was itself a small revolution in its own right, part of the broader strangeness that set this royal family apart from everything that had come before them. But the shadow hanging over all of it was, inevitably, the matter of a son. Egyptian kingship traditionally passed from father to son, and the long-term security of any reign depended heavily on producing a male heir capable of carrying the royal line forward. A king with daughters but no clear son faced a genuinely uncertain future, a question mark hanging permanently over the succession that no amount of prosperity or religious fervor could ever fully erase. For Nefertiti, celebrated and powerful as she clearly was, this absence would have represented a persistent, nagging concern. The one significant thing her considerable gifts and status could not simply command into existence. It's one of history's small cruelties that a woman of such evident capability should have been measured, at least in part, by something so entirely outside her own control. The pressure to produce a son fell on ancient queens with genuinely brutal weight, as though the biological sex of a child were somehow a matter of personal will rather than simple chance. Nefertiti bore 6 children who survived long enough to be formally recorded, a real sign of fertility and survival that many royal mothers of the era would have envied deeply. And yet the lack of a surviving son still counted, in the harsh accounting of dynastic politics, as a kind of quiet failure. The daughters themselves were clearly cherished, or at the very least clearly central to the family's public image. They appear in scenes of genuine, startling intimacy, embraced, held close, included in ways that earlier Egyptian royal art had rarely, if ever, shown before. Whether this reflected true parental tenderness, deliberate political messaging, or the underlying theology of a family that formed the sacred core of an entirely new religion, the visual effect remains the same. These girls were never hidden away. They were displayed prominently as vital members of the divine household, part of the sacred circle through which the sun god's blessings reached the wider world. Several of these daughters would go on to play significant roles in their own right during the tumultuous years that followed, their individual lives caught up directly in the wreckage and aftermath of their parents' extraordinary religious experiment. One of them, Akhetaten, would eventually find herself married to the boy king who came to personally symbolize the full return of the old religious order. The children of Nefertiti were never mere footnotes to her larger story. They were living threads that carried her blood, and something of her legacy, forward into a changed and deeply uncertain future. The way these daughters appear throughout the surviving art, cradled, kissed, openly adored, points to something genuinely new in the ancient world. A style of royal portraiture unlike anything Egypt had produced across its entire long history. To understand just how radical these images truly were, it helps to look closely at those tender family scenes and see exactly how completely they broke with every rule that had governed royal art for 1,000 years before them. Here lies one of the most genuinely touching surprises of the entire Amarna period. Egyptian royal art had always been stiff, formal, and deliberately eternal, kings frozen forever in timeless, unchanging power. But the surviving images of Nefertiti and Akhenaten show something almost shockingly intimate by comparison. The couple appear cradling their young daughters, kissing them, bouncing them playfully on their laps. The little princesses reach out with small, clearly affectionate hands, all of it bathed in the rays of the sun disk, whose light ends in tiny hands offering the ancient symbol of life. Nothing quite like this had ever been carved in stone before. For one brief, radiant moment, the royal family of Egypt let the wider world see them not only as living gods on earth, but as genuine parents. To understand just how startling this really was, you have to picture what came before it. Traditional Egyptian royal art was built entirely for eternity, never for warmth. Kings stood rigid and idealized, their faces serene and deliberately impersonal, their bodies posed in timeless formality. The entire point of the exercise was to project permanence and cosmic order, never ordinary human feeling. A pharaoh was never shown fumbling affectionately with a wriggling toddler. He was shown as an unchanging symbol of raw power, forever composed, forever positioned above the ordinary messiness of daily life. Then came Amarna, and suddenly the royal family was doing the most recognizably human things imaginable. Here is the king with a young daughter perched happily on his knee. Here is Nefertiti lifting one of her children up toward her own face. Here are the little princesses clambering, reaching, and touching, behaving like actual children rather than miniature, idealized statues. The affection on display is never merely implied or symbolic. It's shown directly and tenderly, in a way that would have felt almost unthinkable in the art of previous generations. The carved stone practically radiates genuine domestic warmth. Hovering over all of these scenes is the sun disk itself, its rays streaming steadily downward and ending in tiny outstretched hands. Some of those small hands hold the ancient symbol of life directly toward the noses of the royal family members, almost as though the sun itself were gently breathing life into them. It's a strange and genuinely beautiful image. The god present not as a human or animal figure, but as pure light made almost tangible, reaching down to caress the family it apparently favored above all others. The intimacy of the family and the physical presence of the god are fused together into a single, tender composition. There's real scholarly debate over exactly why this happened, and it's worth being honest that we simply cannot know for certain. Perhaps it reflected genuine affection within the family itself, a household that truly was close, and wished quite sincerely to be seen that way by the wider kingdom. Perhaps it served a deliberate theological purpose, presenting the royal family as the living channel of the sun god's own life-giving love, warmth flowing outward from the Aten through the parents to the children, and outward still to the world beyond. Most likely, it was genuinely both at once real feeling and calculated religious messaging, braided together as the two so often are throughout human history. Whatever the underlying reason, the effect across 30 centuries remains genuinely disarming. We're accustomed to thinking of ancient royalty as remote, formal, and forbidding. And here instead is a couple that looks, for just a moment, almost like any ordinary family, holding their children close beneath a benevolent sun. It humanizes them in a way that very little else surviving from the ancient world quite manages to do. Behind the revolution, behind all the upheaval and burned bridges, there were parents and children, and someone, quite deliberately, chose to show it. And yet we shouldn't let this tenderness fool us into underestimating the queen standing at the center of these scenes. Nefertiti was an affectionate mother and a radiant public icon, yes, but she was also something far more formidable than either of those roles alone. As the reign wore on, the surviving images would begin to show her not merely as a beloved wife and devoted parent, but as a figure of genuinely raw political power, depicted in ways that had always belonged exclusively to kings. As the reign continued, Nefertiti's status climbed to heights almost without parallel for any Egyptian queen before her. In some surviving carvings, she's shown in poses strictly reserved for pharaohs, including the fearsome image of a ruler striking down enemies with a raised weapon. Let that sit for a moment. A queen was being depicted smiting foes, exactly like a king. Some scholars believe this signals that she had become something far more than a royal wife, perhaps a genuine partner in rule, perhaps something even greater still. Whatever the precise truth turns out to be, the message carved permanently into stone is unmistakable. This was one of the most powerful women the ancient world had ever produced. The smiting pose was one of the oldest and most potent images in the entire Egyptian artistic tradition. It showed the king, weapon raised high, seizing his enemies and preparing to strike them down, a visual shorthand for the pharaoh's core role as the mighty protector who crushed chaos and defended the ordered world on behalf of the gods. It had appeared on monuments for literally thousands of years, and it belonged, without exception, to the king alone. It was the ultimate visual statement of royal, masculine, divine power. And there, astonishingly, is Nefertiti taking that very pose. It's genuinely hard to overstate how much this violated convention. Queens simply were not shown this way, ever. The smiting scene was the visual property of kingship itself, and to place a queen inside it was to make a claim that reverberated far beyond any single image. It suggested that Nefertiti wasn't merely honored or elevated in some ceremonial sense, but that she wielded, or was at least meant to be seen as wielding, the core power of the pharaoh himself. In a culture where carved images were considered reality made permanent, this was a declaration of genuinely extraordinary authority. Scholars have puzzled over exactly what this meant for generations now. One view holds that Nefertiti had become a genuine co-ruler, sharing real, substantive power with her husband in a partnership far deeper than the usual bond between an Egyptian king and his queen. Another view suggests she was being elevated towards something even higher still, perhaps a status approaching kingship in her own right. There's no scholarly consensus, and the surviving evidence remains frustratingly fragmentary, but the sheer existence of imagery like this tells us her power had grown to genuinely remarkable proportions by this point in the reign. Whatever the precise arrangement actually was, the practical reality seems reasonably clear. This was a woman operating at the very summit of a great ancient empire, not as a decorative consort standing quietly in the background, but as a figure of real substance and command. In a reign already defined by radical departures from tradition, the elevation of the queen may have been among the most radical departure of all. The royal couple had already remade the gods. It appears they were also, quite deliberately, remaking the very idea of who was allowed to hold and display supreme political power. Set against the broader sweep of ancient history, Nefertiti's position becomes even more striking. Powerful women certainly existed elsewhere in the ancient world, but they tended to be genuine exceptions, often ruling as regents on behalf of young sons, or seizing power amid moments of real crisis and controversy. Here instead was a queen, standing directly alongside a living king, shown in the full regalia of pharaonic might, apparently by careful design and at the very height of the reign. It was an assertion of female power almost without precedent anywhere in Egypt's long recorded history. This dizzying prominence, both in religious worship and in the imagery of raw political power, was inseparable from the wider transformation her husband had already unleashed across the kingdom. A transformation that reshaped not only religion and politics, but the very way Egyptian artists made images in the first place. To understand Nefertiti's world fully, we need to turn now to that artistic revolution and the strange new visual style that captured her and her entire family in stone for all time. The upheaval Akhenaten unleashed was never purely religious in nature. It transformed the very way Egyptians made art. The rigid, idealized style of earlier centuries gave way to a startling new realism, full of elongated skulls, curving bellies, drooping facial features, and flowing, almost fluid bodies. Scholars still argue to this day whether these unusual images reflected the genuine physical appearance of the royal family, a deliberate artistic statement, or a form of spiritual symbolism tied directly to the new faith. Amid all this artistic strangeness, though, the sculptures of Nefertiti stand out consistently for their serene, balanced beauty. She became, in effect, the great exception, a face of calm perfection at the center of one of history's boldest artistic experiments. For thousands of years before this, Egyptian art had followed remarkably consistent, unbending rules. Figures were rendered in idealized, timeless forms, their bodies eternally youthful and perfect, their poses formal and unchanging across generations. The entire point was never to capture a specific real person in a specific real moment. It was to present an eternal, ordered image, fit for the afterlife and for the gods themselves. An Egyptian sculptor working in the old tradition was never chasing individuality. He was upholding a sacred visual tradition nearly as old as the kingdom itself. Then Akhenaten's revolution shattered that mold as well. The new art embraced forms that were strange, deliberately exaggerated, and startlingly unlike anything that had come before it. Figures appeared with elongated skulls and faces, soft protruding bellies, wide hips, thin sinuous limbs, and long drooping features. The king in particular was rendered in ways that would have seemed almost grotesque to earlier generations of Egyptians. His body curved and notably androgynous, utterly at odds with the muscular, idealized pharaohs of centuries past. It was as though the entire grammar of Egyptian art had been rewritten virtually overnight. The debate over exactly why has run on for generations of modern scholarship. One theory takes the images more or less at face value, suggesting the royal family may genuinely have shared some physical trait or medical condition that the art simply recorded faithfully. Another argues the strangeness was a deliberate artistic choice, a chosen visual break with the past, meant to mirror the religious break already underway, a new look purpose-built for a new age. A third theory points toward deeper spiritual meaning, proposing that the exaggerated forms express the theology of the Aten directly, perhaps presenting the king as a being who transcended ordinary human categories entirely. both male and female at once, a living vessel of the god's own creative power. There's likely at least some truth scattered across all three explanations, and no single answer has ever fully won over the scholarly field. What remains certain is the sheer boldness of the whole undertaking. To abandon a visual tradition that had endured, essentially unchanged, for millennia, and replace it with something so radically different, required the exact same fearless conviction that drove every other part of this reign. The art didn't merely decorate the revolution from the outside. It was the revolution, made directly visible in every carved line and molded form, announcing to anyone who looked that the old rules simply no longer applied. And then, amid all this deliberate strangeness, there is Nefertiti, the most famous images of her above all. The celebrated painted bust presents something quite different from the exaggerated forms surrounding her elsewhere in Amarna's art. Here is a face of extraordinary balance and quiet serenity, elegant, composed, almost perfectly proportioned. Whether this reflects a gradual softening of the new artistic style over time, the particular vision of one especially gifted sculptor, or simply the genuine features of the woman herself, the resulting portrait transcends the peculiarities of its own era and speaks directly across 30 centuries. That serene beauty, however, didn't emerge in isolation. It came out of the workshops of real, working artists laboring inside the new city, shaping images of a family who believed themselves genuinely touched by the sun. And the abundance surrounding that family, the wealth and comfort of the royal court itself, extended just as fully to the pleasures of the dinner table as it did to the fine arts. To round out the full picture of Nefertiti's world, it's worth pausing for a moment at the royal feast. Even prophets of a new sun god still had to eat, and the royal table at Amarna was a place of genuine abundance. The Nile provided fish and waterfowl in plenty. The surrounding fields yielded bread and beer, the two great staples of Egyptian life. And the wealthy of the court dined additionally on beef, sweet fruit, honey, and wine, all served in delicate ceremonial vessels. Banquets became occasions for music, dancing, and heavy, lingering scent guests crowned with small cones of perfumed fat that slowly melted throughout the evening. For Nefertiti and her family, feasting was simultaneously pleasure and public performance, a visible display of the plenty the Aten was believed to shower down upon the faithful. But behind all the celebration, the wider kingdom was quietly beginning to strain under the weight of the new order. The foundation of every Egyptian meal, from the poorest household to the grandest royal palace, remained bread and beer. Bread came in dozens of regional varieties, and beer itself was thick, mildly alcoholic, and genuinely nourishing, closer in practice to a kind of liquid loaf than to anything you'd order at a modern bar. But at the royal table, these humble staples were merely the starting point. The wealthy enjoyed a range of foods that most ordinary Egyptians would taste only rarely, if ever, in their entire lives, and the gap between the tables of rich and poor was every bit as stark as the gap between their respective wardrobes. The Nile remained a generous provider for anyone able to command its full bounty. Fish of many varieties, ducks, geese, and other waterfowl all found their way onto the plates of the elite on a regular basis. Beef, expensive and genuinely prized, marked a table of real status, since cattle were costly to raise and even more costly to slaughter. Fruit sweetened the meal further: figs, dates, and grapes, alongside honey, the great natural sweetener of a world that had never once heard of refined sugar. To eat this way was, in a very real sense, to eat like a favorite of the gods, which, under the theology of this particular reign, is precisely how the royal family understood their own position. Wine elevated the royal feast further, still above anything an ordinary household might enjoy. While beer remained the everyday drink of common Egyptians, wine was a genuine luxury, pressed from grapes and carefully stored in labeled jars, served in fine vessels reserved strictly for those of high rank. To drink wine at all was to signal wealth and refinement, another quiet marker of the enormous gulf separating the palace from the fields surrounding it. At a proper royal banquet, wine would have flowed freely among the assembled guests, loosening tongues and warming long, perfumed evenings. And these banquets were about far more than food alone. They were genuine spectacle. Music filled the air, harps, lutes, reed pipes, and the steady rhythmic clap of hands, while trained dancers moved to entertain the assembled guests. Perfume hung heavy over everything, and the wealthy famously wore small cones of scented fat atop their heads, which melted slowly through the course of the evening, releasing fragrance steadily as the hours passed. It was a feast engaging every sense at once, a carefully staged display of pleasure and abundance in equal measure. For Nefertiti and her family, all of this abundance carried meaning that extended well beyond simple enjoyment. In a religion built entirely around the sun as the ultimate source of all life, the overflowing royal table itself functioned as a kind of sermon. Here was visible proof, laid out in food and wine and music, of the Aten's own generosity toward those it favored most. To feast in this context was to demonstrate the tangible blessings of the new faith, the visible reward of the gods' own life-giving light. Pleasure and propaganda dined together, quite literally, at the very same table. But there is a hard irony sitting just beneath all the honey and wine. While the royal court celebrated the abundance their sun god supposedly poured down upon them, the wider Egyptian empire was quietly weakening around them. Beyond the walls of the desert city, far removed from the music and the slowly melting perfume, Egypt's grip on its distant foreign territories was steadily loosening, its allies growing increasingly anxious, and its rivals growing correspondingly bold. The feasting continued, radiant and apparently secure, even as the outer edges of the empire it depended on began, quietly to fray. While the royal couple gazed steadily upward toward their god, real trouble was brewing far beyond the walls of their desert city. Egypt was, after all, an empire with allies and vassal states scattered across the ancient Near East, and their letters to the Egyptian court survive to this very day, baked permanently into clay tablets discovered at Amarna. In them, foreign kings and worried regional governors plead openly for gold, for troops, for simple attention, and all too often, they seem to have been met with nothing but silence. Distracted by his all-consuming religious mission, Akhenaten appears to have allowed the empire's grip on its foreign territories to loosen considerably. Nefertiti reigned at the heart of dazzling splendor, even as the edges of that wider world were quietly fraying apart. Those clay tablets rank among the most remarkable survivals from the entire period, a genuine archive of international correspondence that lay buried at Amarna for literally thousands of years. Written in the standard diplomatic language of the era, they preserve actual letters exchanged between the Egyptian court and rulers and officials from across the wider region. Reading through them today feels a little like eavesdropping on the increasingly anxious phone calls of a superpower's foreign partners, and the overall tone is often far from reassuring. Egypt, during this era, sat at the center of a dense web of relationships stretching across the ancient Near East. Some foreign kings dealt with Egypt as rough equals, exchanging lavish gifts and forging alliances, frequently sealed through marriage and a steady flow of Egyptian gold. Others were genuine vassals, local rulers who held their positions largely thanks to Egyptian backing, and who were expected to remain loyal in return for that continued support. The whole system depended on consistent attention and maintenance, on the great king honoring his commitments, sending real support when it was needed, and keeping his broader network of loyalties intact over time. The surviving letters reveal a system under genuine, growing strain. Foreign kings write requesting the gold for which Egypt had long been famous, sometimes with pointed complaints that previous shipments arrived smaller or of noticeably poorer quality than what had originally been promised. Vassal rulers write with mounting alarm, describing direct threats to their cities, rival powers gaining dangerous ground, enemies pressing hard against their borders, and they begged the Egyptian court repeatedly for troops, for aid, for any sign at all that the great king still cares about their fate. The desperation in some of these messages remains genuinely palpable, even across the gap of more than 3,000 years, and the overall impression that emerges from reading them together is of a royal court that simply wasn't responding the way it should have. Requests appear to go unanswered, letter after letter. Pleas for help seem to hang in the air, unaddressed. Loyal servants of the Egyptian crown write again and again, their frustration clearly deepening as the support they expect and desperately need consistently fails to arrive. It's the portrait of an empire whose leadership had turned its full attention inward and upward, toward its god and its gleaming new capital, while the practical, unglamorous business of maintaining power abroad was quietly, steadily neglected. The underlying reason seems clear enough in hindsight. Akhenaten was consumed entirely by his religious revolution, absorbed completely in the worship of the Aten and the ongoing construction of his sacred city. The hard, unglamorous work of actually running an empire, the constant diplomacy, the careful deployment of resources, the endless management of allies and emerging threats, appears to have suffered badly as a direct result. A ruler can afford to be either a bold visionary or a careful, attentive administrator, and the very best rulers manage to be both at once. But a king lost entirely inside his own vision leaves the practical machinery of state to grind slowly to a halt without him. None of this touched the splendor of the royal court directly, at least not yet. Nefertiti continued to reign amid gardens, feasts, and radiant public imagery, at the dazzling center of a world that still felt entirely secure from the inside. But the foundations were weakening steadily beyond the horizon, the empire's strength slowly ebbing away, even as the royal family kept its gaze fixed firmly on the sun. It's against this backdrop of quiet imperial decline that some of the most enduring artistic achievements of the entire age were being created, including, in one modest workshop, the very portrait that would one day make Nefertiti immortal in the eyes of the modern world. Somewhere in the bustling streets of the new capital, inside the workshop of a master sculptor named Thutmose, an artist set out to capture the queen's likeness in permanent form. Amid plaster models and half-finished heads scattered around the studio, he shaped a portrait bust of Nefertiti out of limestone, coated carefully in painted stucco. In doing so, he created what may well be the single most famous face to survive from the entire ancient world. It was very likely intended as a working model, a reference piece from which other, more formal images would later be copied, never meant to serve as a public monument in its own right. And so it sat, forgotten in the desert sand for more than 3,000 years, quietly waiting for the moment it would eventually astonish the entire world. But that reckoning was still very far in the future. The workshop of Thutmose was, by all indications, a place of genuine practical craft, not some hushed temple of pure artistic inspiration. It would have been cluttered with works in various stages of progress, plaster casts, trial pieces, heads and figures at every stage of completion, the raw working material of a busy studio serving the constant needs of the royal court. This was industry as much as it was artistry, a place where the images that would eventually fill the city's temples and palaces were designed, refined, and produced at scale. The bust itself was made with genuinely considerable skill and care. A core of carved limestone was coated with fine stucco, which allowed the sculptor to shape the facial features with real subtlety, and then paint them afterward in lifelike, vivid color. The result was a portrait of remarkable delicacy, the planes of the face smooth and perfectly balanced, the coloring rich and warm, the whole composition crowned with the tall, distinctive headdress that has since become inseparable from Nefertiti's public image. It was clearly the work of a genuine master, someone who understood both the technical craft involved and the far more elusive art of capturing a living, breathing presence in solid stone. Yet its original purpose was almost certainly humble by the standards of its later, enormous fame. Most scholars today believe it served as a master reference model, from which other formal depictions of the queen could later be copied by less senior artists in the workshop. In a studio producing countless images of the royal family for temples and palaces across the region, a single definitive sculpted portrait would serve as an essential guide, ensuring visual consistency across every subsequent work. If this is correct, then the most celebrated face in the ancient world was created not as a monument for the ages, but as a practical, everyday tool of the workshop, a template rather than a treasure. There's something almost poignant in that realization. The very object that would one day draw millions of admiring visitors and spark genuine international debate was, in its own time, simply a piece of studio equipment, valuable to the artists who relied on it, but never intended for public display or any kind of lasting glory. It captured the queen's likeness precisely, so that likeness could be faithfully reproduced elsewhere. And once its working life was presumably over, it was simply left behind where it sat. And then, not long after, the entire world it belonged to began to come apart at the seams. The city was eventually abandoned. The workshop stood deserted, and the bust was left behind amid the debris as the desert slowly crept back in to reclaim its ground. Sand drifted steadily over the ruins of Amarna, and the painted face of Nefertiti lay hidden in total darkness, buried and forgotten, along with the entire memory of the revolution that had originally produced it. For more than 3,000 years, it waited in complete silence, its extraordinary state of preservation owing a great deal to the very abandonment that had swallowed it whole in the first place. Its eventual rediscovery, and the storm of fame and controversy that would follow, would come only in the modern era, and will arrive at that remarkable moment before tonight's journey is finished. But the bust holds one more small mystery worth pausing on first, a curious detail that has puzzled and quietly delighted observers ever since it first emerged from the sand. It concerns the queen's eyes, and the strange fact that one of them was apparently never finished. Look closely at that legendary bust, and you notice something genuinely haunting. One eye is fully inlaid, carefully detailed and gleaming with reflected light. The other is simply blank, an empty socket, missing its inlay entirely. For years after its discovery, this fed all sorts of speculation. Was the queen perhaps blind in one eye during her lifetime? Had the piece simply been damaged at some point? The likeliest explanation, though, turns out to be far more human and far less dramatic. As a working studio model, the bust may simply never have been finished in the first place. Its second eye left incomplete because the piece had already served its practical purpose before anyone got around to it. That small imperfection, oddly enough, makes her feel more real. A flawless icon, quietly betraying the fact that she was, after all, made by entirely human hands, working under entirely human time pressures. The contrast between the two eyes is genuinely arresting once you notice it directly. One eye is complete, fitted with an inlay that gives it real depth and a lifelike quality, catching available light much as a genuine eye would. The other is a plain, bare socket, its surface left empty where its counterpart clearly should be, on a portrait that is otherwise so refined and so carefully finished in every other respect. The asymmetry seems almost impossible on a work of this evident mastery. It practically demands some kind of explanation. Over the years, that missing eye has inspired no shortage of imaginative theories. Some wondered whether it hinted at a genuine physical condition, a queen who had actually lost sight in one eye, faithfully recorded by an honest sculptor. Others suggested the inlay had simply fallen out and been lost somewhere during the long centuries the bust spent buried underground, or that the piece had suffered damage at some later point during its long journey through time. Each idea carries its own particular appeal, and each tries, in its own way, to make sense of that unsettling blank gaze staring out from an otherwise perfect face. But the explanation most scholars actually favor today is quieter and considerably more human than any of these dramatic theories. If the bust really was a working studio model, a master reference rather than a finished public monument, then it may simply never have required a second finished eye at all. Its entire purpose was to guide the creation of other, later images, and for that specific purpose, the piece was already essentially complete. The sculptor may have inlaid a single eye purely to demonstrate the proper technique to his workshop assistants, and simply never bothered finishing the second, because the object itself was a working tool, not a treasure meant for public display. There's a lovely irony sitting in all of this. The single most famous face to survive from the entire ancient world, an image now synonymous with flawless beauty, is, in fact, unfinished in a way that would have mattered to absolutely no one at the time it was made. It was never meant to be gazed upon by millions of people from dozens of countries. It was meant to sit quietly in a working studio and help artists get the queen's likeness exactly right. And oddly enough, that small imperfection may be part of exactly what makes the bust so compelling to modern eyes. A face that's too flawless can start to feel cold and unreal, more like an abstract ideal than an actual person. The missing eye punctures that sense of perfection just slightly. A small human accident that reminds us this was an object made by real hands, in a real workshop, subject to all the ordinary shortcuts and unfinished business of any working studio anywhere in history. The flaw humanizes the icon, letting a bit of genuine reality bleed through the surrounding beauty. It feels fitting in a way that our single most vivid image of Nefertiti should carry this small hint of incompleteness. Because around the very same time such portraits were being crafted in that workshop, the queen herself begins to grow strangely incomplete within the wider historical record as well. Her abundant, constant presence in the art and inscriptions of the reign, so steady, so radiant for so many years, is about to do something deeply mysterious. It is about to stop entirely. Then, without any real warning, she disappears from the record. Sometime around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, the abundant images and inscriptions naming Nefertiti simply stop appearing. For a woman who had been carved onto temple walls and monuments across the entire land, this sudden silence is genuinely unsettling to encounter. Did she die? Perhaps in some plague that a number of historians believe may have swept through the region during these years. Did she fall from royal favor and quietly vanish into disgrace? Or did she transform into someone else entirely, shedding her old identity in much the same way her husband had once done? The historical record goes quiet at precisely the moment we most want it to speak, and the mystery of her ultimate fate has genuinely tormented historians ever since. The sheer suddenness of it is what makes this so strange. For years, Nefertiti had been everywhere worshipping the Aten, embracing her daughters, riding proudly in chariots, standing beside the king, even depicted in poses of raw pharaonic power. Her image had saturated the art of the entire reign. And then, around that 12th year, the steady flow of images and references thins out dramatically and eventually dries up completely. A woman who had been one of the most depicted figures anywhere in the kingdom seems to step behind a curtain and simply never come back out. The abundance becomes total silence, almost overnight. The most straightforward explanation, of course, is simple death. People died constantly in the ancient world, queens very much included, and that world offered countless different ways for it to happen. Some scholars point to evidence suggesting that a wave of illness, quite possibly a genuine plague, may have moved through the region during exactly these years, carrying off multiple members of the royal circle in fairly rapid succession. If Nefertiti fell victim to disease like so many others, her sudden disappearance from the record would require no elaborate explanation whatsoever. She simply died, as people inevitably do, and the images stopped because their living subject was now gone. But death is far from the only theory on offer, and the alternatives are exactly what keep this particular mystery so alive today. Some historians have wondered whether Nefertiti instead fell from royal favor, whether some rupture in the royal partnership pushed her out of her position of extraordinary prominence and into quiet disgrace instead. Under this reading, The silence isn't the silence of the grave at all, but rather the silence of deliberate erasure, or perhaps a voluntary retreat from public life. A once mighty queen quietly removed from the visible workings of the court for reasons we simply can no longer recover from the surviving evidence. And then there is the most tantalizing possibility of all, that she didn't vanish so much as transform into someone new entirely. Her husband had once shed his own identity completely, discarding one royal name and adopting another to mark a genuinely new phase of his personal mission. What if Nefertiti did something broadly similar, setting aside her familiar name and role in order to become someone new? Someone who then appears in the surviving records under an entirely different identity, at precisely the moment the old, familiar Nefertiti seems to disappear. In this particular version of events, she doesn't fade away at all. She is, in effect, reborn under another name. This is the deeply frustrating heart of the entire puzzle. The historical record falls silent at the exact moment it could tell us the most useful information. We're left with a queen of genuinely dazzling prominence who simply exits the historical stage without clear explanation, and a whole cluster of competing theories that can be neither firmly proven nor entirely dismissed. Death, disgrace, or transformation, each remains entirely possible, and each paints a very different picture of exactly how her remarkable story ultimately reached its close. Of all these competing possibilities, one has proven especially seductive to historians, because it fits so neatly with everything we've already seen about her steady, unrelenting rise toward the fullness of royal power. It's the theory that Nefertiti didn't merely survive her own disappearance from the record, but actually ascended through it, shedding the title of queen entirely to take up something far greater still. It's the theory that the woman once shown smiting enemies like a king may, in the end, have genuinely become one. One of the most tantalizing theories in all of Amarna scholarship suggests that Nefertiti didn't vanish at all. Instead, she may have risen even higher, adopting a new royal name and ruling as co-king beside her husband, and perhaps even as sole pharaoh following his eventual death. A shadowy ruler known to us as Nefertiti appears in the surviving records from around this exact time, and a number of scholars argue this figure was Nefertiti herself, a queen who had effectively become a living pharaoh in every meaningful sense but name. If this theory is correct, it would represent one of the most remarkable personal transformations in the entirety of Egyptian history, a great royal wife who ultimately seized the full power of the crown itself. The theory carries an undeniable elegance, because it resolves the mystery of her disappearance not with an ending, but with an elevation instead. Under this reading, the reason the familiar figure of Nefertiti fades from the historical record is simply that she stopped being merely Nefertiti. Just as her husband had once cast off one royal name in favor of another to mark his personal transformation, she too may have adopted a new royal identity, moving from the role of queen into something that carried the full authority of a king. At the center of this idea sits the elusive figure of Nefertiti, a ruler who appears in the surviving records of this turbulent period, holding genuine pharaonic status. The identity of this particular ruler has been debated at real length by Egyptologists, but a strong current of current scholarship connects the name directly to Nefertiti, arguing that this was the queen herself, now exalted all the way to actual kingship. If that connection genuinely holds, then Nefertiti didn't simply survive the 12th year of the reign. She rose through it, becoming a co-ruler, and quite possibly a full sovereign in her own right following Akhenaten's eventual death. In a way, this would fit neatly with everything we've already seen of her. This was a woman who had been shown performing the highest sacred rites, who had been depicted in the smiting pose traditionally reserved for kings alone, whose prominence had climbed steadily and deliberately toward the very summit of royal power. A final step into full kingship would represent less of a sudden leap and more of a natural culmination, the logical endpoint of a rise that had already broken nearly every rule about what an Egyptian queen was permitted to be. The woman shown wielding a king's power may simply, in the end, have claimed it outright. Female pharaohs were genuinely rare across Egyptian history, but they weren't entirely unknown either. The long, sprawling history of the kingdom included a small handful of women who took up the complete authority of kingship, ruling as pharaohs in their own right rather than merely as queens or temporary regents. So the basic notion of a woman holding this supreme office wasn't unthinkable, even if it remained genuinely extraordinary by any measure. If Nefertiti truly joined that small, remarkable company of female pharaohs, she would stand among the very few women ever to have ruled Egypt with the complete, unchallenged power of the crown. And yet, maddeningly, none of this can be stated with real confidence. The surviving evidence for these particular years is scarce and genuinely difficult to interpret. The names and titles involved remain ambiguous. The specific identifications remain hotly contested among specialists. Scholars continue to argue over exactly who Nefertiti really was, over the precise sequence of rulers during this confused transitional period, and over whether all the individual pieces truly fit together the way this particular theory suggests. The overall picture is a fragmented mosaic with far too many tiles missing, and reasonable experts continue to read the surviving gaps in genuinely different ways. What remains clear is that the world Nefertiti had helped build was, by this point, entering its final and most fragile phase. Whether she ultimately died, faded from view, or rose to become a genuine king in her own right, the great religious experiment of the Aten was steadily approaching its collapse, and the visionary force driving it was nearing his own end. The radical dream of a single, all-powerful sun god was about to face a reckoning that no amount of royal will, however fierce, could ultimately withstand. Whatever became of Nefertiti personally, the revolution she'd helped build did not long outlive its two founders. Akhenaten died after roughly 17 years on the throne, leaving behind a kingdom genuinely exhausted by his religious experiment, and a faith that few Egyptians beyond the immediate royal circle had ever truly embraced in their hearts. The dream of a single sun god, so blinding in its original intensity, began to dim almost the very moment its greatest champion was gone. The shining city in the desert, raised with such genuine fervor, would soon stand nearly empty, and the surviving daughters of Nefertiti would find themselves caught directly in the wreckage of their parents' astonishing gamble. 17 years is, by any measure, a substantial reign, long enough to rename temples, rewrite religious doctrine, and remake the entire tradition of royal art, long enough to raise a brand new city out of empty sand from nothing. But it wasn't nearly long enough to change the underlying heart of a civilization that had believed in its many gods for well over 1,000 years. The revolution had been imposed entirely from the top down, driven by the personal will of a single king and his exalted queen, and it had never truly sunk deep roots into the wider Egyptian population. Beneath the official worship of the Aten, the old religious devotions almost certainly lingered on quietly, stubborn and largely unbroken. When Akhenaten finally died, the force holding the entire experiment together died along with him. A revolution sustained by one man's obsessive personal vision is desperately vulnerable to that same man's death, and this one proved to be no exception to that pattern. Without the king there to drive it forward, to fund it directly, to insist upon it at every turn, the new religious order began losing its grip almost immediately. The energy that had once raised entire temples to the sun and chiseled the old gods off 1,000 monuments simply drained away once its original source was gone for good. The kingdom Akhenaten left behind was, by many surviving signs, genuinely worn down by his singular fixation. The neglected foreign empire, the strained relationships with once loyal allies, the vast royal resources poured relentlessly into a single religious dream. All of it had taken a real, cumulative toll on the country. Egypt had spent 17 years serving one king's personal spiritual mission, and there must have been a widespread, if largely unspoken, weariness with the entire enterprise by the time he finally died. The appetite for continuing the experiment once its original architect was gone appears, from the historical record, to have been very small indeed. The daughters of Nefertiti now stood exposed in the ruins of it all. These young women, raised at the radiant center of the revolution, celebrated openly in tender family scenes, part of the sacred royal circle from birth, suddenly found themselves living in a world beginning to turn firmly against everything their parents had built together. Their futures became entangled directly in the desperate politics of a collapsing royal order. Their marriages and their fates were shaped almost entirely by the urgent need to salvage a royal dynasty that had bet absolutely everything on a god the kingdom was now quietly preparing to abandon. The shining city in the desert, Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, faced the bleakest possible future of all. Built specifically to serve a single religious idea, it had no real reason to continue existing once that idea fell permanently out of favor. With the royal court preparing to move on, and the new religion crumbling around it, the great capital, raised so swiftly out of nothing, was destined to be abandoned just as swiftly left, in the end, to the very sand it had originally risen from. The dream had briefly had a heartbeat, and now that heartbeat had finally stopped. What followed was not merely a quiet fading away, but an active, deliberate return, a full swing back toward everything Akhenaten and Nefertiti had once tried so hard to overthrow. The old gods, pushed aside and struck from the monuments, were about to come surging back into their ancient places of honor. Egypt, it turned out, had never actually stopped wanting them, and the coming restoration of the old order would sweep away nearly the last traces of the Sun King's astonishing gamble. Egypt, it turned out, wanted its gods back. Within just a few short years, the royal court abandoned Amarna entirely, and a young boy took the throne, a boy known to us today as Tutankhamun. Tellingly, this boy king changed his own name away from the Aten and back toward the traditional god Amen, and he married Ankhesenpan, one of Nefertiti's own surviving daughters, who likewise adjusted her name to match the shifting religious tide. The old temples reopened their doors. The traditional priesthood returned to its former positions of influence, and the vast, ancient machinery of Egypt's traditional faith rumbled slowly back to life. The sun disk that had briefly ruled the heavens alone was quietly lowered from its throne, and the world Nefertiti had known faded steadily into memory. The abandonment of Amarna itself was the clearest possible sign of this reversal. The city that had been conjured out of empty desert to serve the Aten, filled with palaces, open-air temples, and the daily bustle of an entire relocated government, was simply left behind. The royal court moved away. The ordinary people who'd lived there drifted off to other cities, and the great capital of the revolution began its long, slow slide back into the surrounding sand. A city built entirely for a single idea died along with that idea, emptied out again almost as quickly as it had once been filled. The boy who came to the throne after Akhenaten's death is famous today, far beyond his actual importance during his own short lifetime, thanks to the extraordinary later survival of his largely intact tomb. But in the context of Nefertiti's own story, what matters most about him is what his reign actually represented. Under his name, we can watch the old religious order being deliberately and systematically restored. The revolution wound back step by careful step. The kingdom steered firmly back toward the very traditions it had so recently abandoned. He was the instrument, whether fully willing or simply young and carefully guided by older advisors, of this quiet counter-revolution. The clearest marker of that reversal was, once again, a change of names. The young king had originally borne a name honoring the Aten, and he cast it off in favor of one honoring Amen instead. The very god Akhenaten had once tried so hard to eclipse entirely. It was the exact mirror image of what Akhenaten himself had done a generation earlier. A name change to signal a genuine change of faith, only now the movement ran in precisely the opposite direction, back toward the old gods rather than away from them. His young queen, Nefertiti's own daughter, made the identical shift, adjusting her own name in the same restorative direction. There's a quiet poignancy hiding in that small detail. A daughter of Nefertiti, raised at the very heart of the sun cult, celebrated repeatedly in its distinctive art, bearing a name tied directly to the Aten, now set that name aside entirely to embrace the very tradition her own parents had fought so hard to overthrow. Whatever she may have personally felt about it, and we simply cannot know, her renaming embodied the collapse of her family's entire great project in miniature. The children of the revolution were quietly absorbed back into the restoration, their personal identities reshaped to fit the returning religious order. With these changes came the full, comprehensive revival of the old religion. The temples that had been neglected or deliberately defaced were reopened and carefully restored. The priesthood of Amen, so brutally sidelined for nearly 2 decades, returned to its former place of influence and wealth. And the immense, ancient machinery of Egyptian worship, with its many gods and its deeply rooted rituals, rumbled steadily back into full motion. The sun disk that had blazed so briefly at the summit of the heavens was gently but firmly lowered, taking its place once more as merely one aspect of the divine among many others. The restoration, however, would not be content simply to move on quietly. Those who followed didn't merely wish to return to the old ways. They wished to pretend the entire revolution had never happened at all, to scrub it thoroughly from the official record and cast its 2 authors into total oblivion. And in that determined campaign of forgetting, Nefertiti, once so radiant and so visible everywhere, was in genuine danger of being erased entirely from the memory of her own people. The rulers who came after Tutankhamun did not merely move on from the Amarna period. They actively worked to make the whole episode disappear. Later kings labored to strike Akhenaten, his god, and his entire family from the official historical record, tearing down his monuments, defacing his inscriptions, and leaving his name off the sacred lists of legitimate pharaohs entirely. He became known, in what few later references survive, only as an enemy or simply as that criminal, a heretic best left forgotten by history. In their determined zeal to erase the revolution completely, they very nearly erased Nefertiti right along with it. For thousands of years afterward, she survived only in scattered fragments and buried ruins, a queen deliberately swept beneath the sands of her own homeland. There's a grim kind of symmetry in what happened next. Akhenaten had once sent workers out to chisel the name of Amen from monuments across the entire land, attacking a god by attacking his very name. Now the exact same weapon was turned squarely against him. His own name and images were defaced and systematically destroyed. His monuments were dismantled piece by piece. The record of his entire reign was systematically attacked from every angle. The man who had once tried so hard to erase the old gods found himself, in turn, marked for a very similar erasure, a fitting and thoroughly merciless historical reversal. The campaign was genuinely thorough. Later rulers took stone blocks directly from Akhenaten's abandoned monuments and reused them in their own new building projects, quite literally dismantling the physical fabric of the revolution and repurposing it for entirely different ends. Inscriptions were defaced. Images were hacked away. The visible traces of the whole episode were steadily removed from the landscape, one monument at a time. This was never passive neglect. It was active demolition, a deliberate, sustained effort to unmake the memory of what had actually happened. Most telling of all was the treatment of Akhenaten in the official record of Egyptian kings. Egypt maintained careful lists of its legitimate rulers, a kind of sacred roll call of pharaohs stretching back unbroken through the generations. Akhenaten was simply left off these lists entirely by those who came after him. In the eyes of later generations, he was not a true king worth honoring, but a heretic worth forgetting completely, referred to, in the rare surviving mentions of him at all, as an enemy or a criminal. The kingdom he had ruled for 17 years tried, quite deliberately, to write him out of its own history altogether. And in that sweeping act of erasure, Nefertiti was caught up as well. She had been so inseparable from the revolution, her image so tightly bound up with the sun cult, her entire prominence so tied to the reign now being actively condemned by her successors. To erase Akhenaten and his god was, almost inevitably, to erase her too. The queen who had once been carved across countless temples, shown in worship and in raw power alike, celebrated as few queens in Egyptian history ever had been, was swept away along with the whole heretical age she'd helped create. Her radiance was buried beneath the determined forgetting of later generations. So for roughly 3,000 years, Nefertiti effectively ceased to exist in the living memory of the world. She survived only in scattered fragments, in defaced carvings, in buried ruins, in objects abandoned and forgotten deep in the sand. The living memory of who she actually was gone, deliberately extinguished by people who genuinely wished the entire episode had never occurred in the first place. A woman who had once stood at the very summit of a great empire vanished into total silence, not by simple accident, but by careful design, hidden even from her own people's later history. It's one of the strange, quiet mercies of time that ruins can sometimes preserve just as much as they destroy. The very abandonment that swallowed Amarna whole also sealed away its buried treasures, protecting them beneath the sand from the kind of active reuse and destruction that claimed so much else from the period. And so, in the ruins of a long-forgotten workshop, a painted face waited patiently in the darkness through century after century, until at last, in the modern age, human hands would break through the sand and bring the beautiful one back into the light. And then, in the year 1912, a German archaeological team digging through the ruins of Amarna broke into the abandoned workshop of the sculptor Thutmose and lifted from the surrounding debris a painted face that had waited more than 3,000 years in total darkness. The Nefertiti bust emerged from the sand almost perfectly preserved, and the queen who had been so thoroughly erased was suddenly, spectacularly remembered by the entire world. Today, her image sits in a museum far from the Nile, admired by millions of visitors each year, at the center of an ongoing international debate about exactly where she truly belongs. She began her story as a name that simply meant, "The beautiful one has arrived." In the end, against every determined effort to make people forget her, she came back, and this time, it seems, she may never leave again. The moment of her rediscovery has since become the stuff of genuine archaeological legend. Working carefully through the remains of the ruined city, the excavators eventually reached the buried workshop where, so long before, an artist had once shaped the queen's likeness by hand. And there, amid the debris of a studio abandoned for well over 3,000 years, they uncovered the bust, its colors still vivid, its features still perfectly serene, its preservation so astonishing that it seemed to have escaped the ordinary ravages of time almost entirely. A face erased so thoroughly from official history gazed back out at the modern world, whole and undeniably beautiful. The preservation itself owed everything to the very burial that had once meant total oblivion. Sealed away inside the collapsed workshop, protected by the sand that had swallowed Amarna whole, the bust had been spared both the deliberate destruction and the slow natural decay that claimed so many other treasures from the same era. The very forces that had worked to erase Nefertiti from memory had also, quite unwittingly, kept her portrait perfectly safe. What had once been lost was, in the end, found precisely because it had been so thoroughly buried and forgotten in the first place. The impact of the discovery, once it was properly understood, was immediate and genuinely enormous. Here was a face of extraordinary beauty and startling immediacy, a portrait that seemed to leap directly across the intervening millennia to meet the modern eye. The bust rapidly became one of the most celebrated objects anywhere in the world, an icon of ancient Egypt, a symbol of timeless elegance, the single image most people today instinctively summon when they try to imagine a queen of the Nile. The forgotten woman became, almost overnight, one of the most recognized faces in the entire history of human civilization. That fame has brought real controversy along with it. The bust today resides in a museum far from Egypt, and its continued presence there has long been genuinely contested. There have been repeated calls for its return to the land that originally produced it, ongoing arguments over the exact circumstances of its removal, and a persistent, unresolved tension about where a treasure like this truly belongs. The queen who was once fought over in the politics of ancient Egypt remains, in a very real sense, fought over still. Her image caught up in thoroughly modern debates about cultural heritage and rightful ownership. There's a deep irony sitting at the very center of her story. Nefertiti was deliberately erased, written out of her own people's history, buried beneath the sand of her own homeland by those who genuinely wished her forgotten forever. And yet she has become, 3,000 years later, more famous than almost any other figure from her entire era, her face recognized across the whole globe. The determined campaign to make her vanish failed utterly in the long run. She was hidden for 3 full millennia, only to return more visible than ever before, an icon precisely because she came so close to being lost completely. Her name, right from the very beginning, was a kind of quiet prophecy. The beautiful one has arrived, an announcement of her presence carved directly into the world. It proved truer than anyone at the time could possibly have imagined, and truer still a second time over. She arrived once in the flesh, to reign at the dazzling heart of a genuine religious revolution. And she arrived again, after 30 full centuries of darkness, lifted gently from the sand back into the light, remembered against every determined effort ever made to forget her. Having survived erasure, burial, and the long silence of the ages, the beautiful one had truly returned. And this time, it seems, she is here to stay. And so we come gently to the end of tonight's journey, drifting back out of the golden desert and the blazing light of that ancient sun disk, back to the quiet comfort of wherever you happen to be resting right now. Tonight we walked beside a woman who has been remembered, then forgotten, then remembered again. A queen whose beauty somehow outlasted entire empires, and whose story still refuses to sit quietly still. Think of everything she moved through in her short life. A childhood we can barely glimpse today. A marriage that quietly reshaped an entire kingdom. A god pulled down from the sky and set above all the rest. A whole city raised from empty sand. And then, after all that dazzling height, a vanishing so complete that we still argue passionately about exactly how it happened, thousands of years later. She was celebrated as few women in the ancient world ever were, carved into temples, shown in both worship and raw political power, and then deliberately erased by those who wished the entire bright, strange chapter had simply never occurred at all. There's something genuinely humbling in that. For all her radiance, for all her power, Nefertiti could not ultimately escape the tides of time and politics, could not keep her shining city from the sand, or her own name from the chisel of those who came after her. And yet here we are, 3,000 years later, still speaking quietly of her, still gazing at that serene painted face, still genuinely wondering who she truly was underneath it all. The determined effort to forget her failed completely. The beautiful one came back. So tonight, as you settle into your own soft bed, beneath a roof that keeps out both the desert's cold and its heat alike, spare a gentle thought for the people who lived and dreamed so very long ago. They built. They believed. They loved their children in the light of a sun they genuinely believed to be divine. Their world eventually crumbled around them, but their story endured anyway, waiting patiently in the dark to be remembered again. Rest easy now. The sun will rise again in the morning, just as it always has, just as it did for her. Sleep well.